For 8 years, she waited for her mom to come back so they could finally live together, just the two of them. Her mom did come back, but she brought a man no one had asked for or expected. And from that moment on, the life she had imagined began to fall apart. But let's start from the beginning. Ufa, 2016. Irina was about 6 years old when, at some point, her mother simply stopped coming home. She didn't disappear, no. Alfia was taken away, and where exactly, no one really explained to Irina at the time. She was moved in with her grandmother and aunt, and that's when a completely different chapter began. Without her mother, without understanding what had actually happened. With the feeling that something had broken, though at her age, she couldn't quite grasp what. And then the years stretched on. Irina grew up, went to school, matured, while her mother remained somewhere far away. Alfia was serving time at a correctional facility where phone use was permitted, so there were calls. The connection wasn't completely severed, but the distance never went away. 8 years, that's half her entire life at that point. Later, during questioning, she would say it plainly. "I really waited for my mom. I thought when she got out, we'd live together, just the two of us." April 2024. Alfia was finally released. By then, Irina was already 14, no longer the child who used to draw pictures and send them to her mom. She was a teenager now, with her own habits, her own personality, and she had one expectation: Mom comes home and now they're together. But Alfia didn't come alone. She arrived with a man. They settled in the same neighborhood where Irina had grown up. A new apartment, a new way of life, and a stranger at the table whom she had never asked for or expected. Alfia was 20 when she gave birth. She was trained as a pastry chef, but at that point, none of that mattered much. Irina's father had by then firmly descended into alcohol dependency. He wasn't working. There was no money in the house. Alfia would later tell journalists that the only food regularly available at home was cat food. And so she watched all of this unfold, hoping somehow things would work out, that the situation would improve. It didn't. At some point, people appeared who offered work, simple, or so it seemed at the time, picking up and delivering drop packages with illegal substances. Alfia agreed. She didn't have her own car, so everything had to be done by taxi. In the evenings, when buses had stopped running, she would order rides to the outskirts, to industrial zones, to the private housing sector. The drivers, by her own account, understood everything but didn't interfere. She was paid around 50,000 rubles a month, but most of it went right back, to expenses, to taxis, to communication. Sometimes the routes passed right by police stations. She had to pick up packages practically under surveillance cameras. And later, she would recount all of this calmly, without excuses, as if describing someone else's life. This went on for more than a month. In 2016, she was detained. At the trial, a number was announced: 11 years for distribution. Her daughter was handed over to her grandmother, and Alfia was taken away. Later, the sentence was reduced, but back then, in that courtroom, the number sounded like a verdict not just for the mother. 6 years in the sewing workshop of a women's correctional colony. Alfia would later describe it in 3 words: like being through a nightmare. She didn't share details, but the phrasing itself says enough. Every day the same thing, endless shifts, extremely harsh conditions. She was assigned to production and stayed there until she finally secured a transfer. And what kept her going all that time was one thought: her daughter was waiting, and someday she could go back and start over. After 6 years, Alfia was transferred to a correctional center. Officially, it was considered something like early release, but in reality, it was a dormitory. Separate male and female blocks, 3 rooms each, 15 people per room, 0 personal space, but at least the doors weren't locked from the outside anymore. She commuted to work herself, across the city, shifts from 9 to 6, still as a seamstress. They could wake her in the middle of the night and tell her she needed to come in for an urgent shift. Overtime was normal, but compared to what came before, the correctional center felt almost like freedom. And here's the most important part: they were allowed to use phones. For the first time in 6 years, Alfia could not just wait, but call, text, find out what was happening beyond the walls, rebuild connections that had seemed lost. At some point, a person appeared among her contacts, someone she had known for a long time, from the other end of the country and from another life. She started a correspondence. Who was on the other end would become clear later, but it was within the walls of the correctional center that the future life Alfia planned to return to began to take shape. A life where she wouldn't just have her daughter by her side. His name was Semyon. He and Alfia had grown up in the same courtyard in Ufa, ran around together, knew each other from early childhood. Then life took them in different directions. Semyon left the city and settled in St. Petersburg. He married a woman named Yekaterina. Alfia stayed, met another man, gave birth to Irina, raised her daughter. Years passed, and each lived their own life. They wrote to each other, made plans for a life together, two people, both with pasts, on opposite sides of the map. He in St. Petersburg, she behind walls. But the distance didn't matter, and probably for both of them, it seemed like a chance to start fresh. At some point, Semyon told Yekaterina that he was going back home, to Ufa, to another woman, who at that point hadn't even been released yet. The divorce went smoothly. Later, Yekaterina would contact law enforcement, but that would only come to light at the trial. In April, Alfia was released, and Semyon was waiting for her at the gates. He came, as promised, met her, took her away. But it should be noted that Irina already knew about him by then. Her mother had told her, and even before Alfia's release, she had sent a gift to her daughter through Semyon. The three of them were already in contact, so when all three finally met in person, they made the decision together. They would live as a family. Irina agreed, even with some curiosity at first. A new person, a new life, Mom finally by her side. And here's the context that matters. Her own father had disappeared by that point. There was no male figure in her life at all, not a single man around. And then there was Semyon, an adult who had come from another city for her mother, someone who didn't abandon her. They settled in. An apartment in the same Ufa neighborhood where Irina had grown up. School nearby, familiar streets, but inside, the dynamic was different now. A mother who had been absent for 8 years was now trying to be a mother again. A man who had lived in another city for 8 years was now trying to become part of someone else's family. And a teenager who had been waiting for one thing all this time and received something entirely different. From the outside, it looked normal. 3 people under one roof, shared daily life, conversations at dinner. Irina went to school. Alfia got a job. Semyon was around. For a while, everything held together. The thing is, each of these 3 had their own version of a normal life. Alfia wanted a family, Semyon wanted to be needed, and Irina just wanted her mom. These 3 desires hadn't collided yet, but as would later become clear, it was only a matter of time. The first warning sign came from school. Irina's grades dropped. Several subjects required retakes. She missed one of them and told her mother she didn't need to go. She lied. Alfia found out, and from that moment on, the softness ended. Together with Semyon, they took control. The phone was now given out for limited periods and taken away an hour before bed. They started monitoring homework, the schedule, where Irina went and who she talked to. To the adults, this seemed logical. They discovered a lie, so tightened the rules. But for Irina, this was a completely different experience. For 8 years, she had lived with her grandmother and aunt, without a firm hand, without hourly control, without some stranger suddenly deciding when she could hold her own phone. She was used to a different way of life, and transitioning to this new one through restrictions and checks felt not like care, but like pressure. Now, the adults had their reasons. The aunt Irina had been living with all those years had noticed something was off earlier. She saw that her niece was visiting dating sites, said something was wrong with her, and when Irina asked Semyon to fix her laptop, he discovered explicit material on the hard drive. Later, Alfia herself found similar drawings there. The response was predictable: even more control, even less freedom. They decided the problem was Irina, that she had fallen under bad influence, that they needed to hold on tighter. And the more they squeezed, the more she pulled away. The relationship between her and Semyon deteriorated rapidly. Between her and her mother, too. There was a surveillance camera in the apartment. Alfia and Semyon didn't hide it. They installed it to monitor Irina. The camera recorded the living room, the main space of the apartment, the same space where the family spent time together, and the same space where, according to Irina, what would eventually turn everything upside down would later happen. But before that came August, summer. Irina was retaking exams at school, her mother was leaving for work, and Semyon stayed home. They were alone together, and according to Irina's testimony, that's when it all began. Semyon came to her room, started scolding her about her behavior, and then pushed her onto the bed. What happened next, she would describe to investigators later in November in the dry language of a protocol, and this wasn't the only time. According to her, similar incidents occurred every time her mother left and they were alone together. After these episodes, he would likely give her money, for transportation, for food, not as a gift, as payment for silence. And she stayed silent for a long time, not because she didn't understand, but because there was no one to tell. Her mother had just come back, was happy, had chosen this man, had been waiting for him, was building plans with him, had staked her entire new life on him. How do you tell her that the person she brought into their home was doing this, and the camera was in the living room? Alfia would later say there was nothing incriminating on the footage, but then she would add that the investigator had seized the recordings. What was actually on them would remain a point of contention. Irina lived in that apartment under surveillance and yet remained completely alone. The camera captured the space but didn't capture what was happening behind the closed bedroom door. September 9th, 2024. Irina didn't come to her mother on her own. Alfia herself asked her to tell what had happened. She had probably noticed something, the withdrawal, the tension, the change in behavior, or perhaps fragments of information had reached her from someone in their circle. Either way, she asked the question, and Irina told her. The exact details would become known later, from her testimony to the investigator. But the essence was simple. Semyon was touching her when their mother left. Alfia listened and began asking clarifying questions, and what she heard in response didn't convince her. According to the mother, nothing added up. Irina had been behaving normally all those days after the alleged incident, interacting with her stepfather, not avoiding him, showing no fear. In Alfia's view, that's not how someone behaves after what her daughter was describing. She questioned Semyon as well. He was surprised, assured her that nothing like that had ever happened. And that's when the mother drew her conclusion. In her own words, her daughter was, quote, "one says whatever suits her." Alfia decided that Irina had made up the entire story to shift focus from her problems at school, to stop getting in trouble for missed retakes, to get her phone back and ease the control. The conversation ended with nothing. No report was filed. Semyon stayed in the apartment. Life continued as if the conversation had never happened. Irina remained in the house with the person she had complained about, and with a mother who had chosen not to believe her. This was the first time she had asked for help. Help didn't come. Even before the school year started, Irina asked her friend Olya to go with her to visit Semyon's mother, to drop off some belongings. An ordinary visit, an ordinary reason, but Irina had a different purpose in mind. There, at this woman's home, she first complained about everyday things. Her stepfather wouldn't let her go out, controlled her every move, and then she started signaling to Olya, hinting that her friend should tell the story for her. She couldn't do it herself, or she didn't dare, or she was afraid she wouldn't be believed again, just like with her mother. Olya understood and said it directly. Semyon was groping Irina and behaving inappropriately with her. Semyon's mother was surprised, but not in the way someone is surprised when they hear something impossible. She remembered something. Her son had told her himself about an inappropriate joke he had made toward his stepdaughter, but it was just a joke, according to him. And here's what's telling. The mother didn't ask what exactly he meant, didn't ask under what circumstances, why an adult man would allow himself something like that toward someone else's underage stepdaughter. The conversation apparently ended there. Semyon's mother didn't call Alfia, didn't ask her son any additional questions, didn't become concerned. A joke remained a joke, and this is where the full picture becomes visible. Irina tried 3 times. She told her mother, who didn't believe her. She had her friend tell the stepfather's mother, who wrote it off as a joke. Every time, the information reached an adult. Every time, the adult decided it wasn't serious. And every time after that, Irina returned to the same apartment, to the same person. In October, Irina told her mother again, directly, her stepfather had assaulted her. Alfia listened, and this time asked more detailed questions. When asked exactly when it had happened, Irina named a specific moment. But it turned out that at that exact time, Semyon had been on the phone with Alfia. The mother remembered this, a discrepancy. And for Alfia, this became final confirmation. Her daughter was lying. By that point, a complete picture had formed in the mother's mind. Problems at school, the lie about the retake, explicit material on the laptop, the drawings, the dating sites, conflicts from adolescence, the battle over the phone. Now accusations that didn't line up chronologically. It all added up to one version. A quote two who would do anything to win her freedom and remove the person standing in the way of living as she used to. For Alfia, this version was probably just convincing because the alternative would mean that the man for whom she had come back to life after 8 years behind bars was exactly who her daughter said he was, and that would destroy absolutely everything. The second accusation was rejected. No report was filed again. Semyon stayed in the apartment. Only one option remained, and it lay beyond the walls of that apartment. That conversation on September 9th, one detail remained off camera. Alfia invited her daughter to talk not about the assault allegations. She called it a quote 3. In other words, before the conversation even started, she had downgraded the status of what was happening. Not an accusation, not a complaint, a quarrel, a domestic conflict between a stepdaughter and a stepfather. And second, Semyon was in the room. He was present during this conversation. Irina had to describe what had been done to her in the presence of the person she was accusing, face to face, in the same space, under his gaze. Perhaps for a moment she believed that her mother finally wanted to listen, that this was a chance, that everything would change now, and she spoke in front of him. After her account, Alfia concluded she was lying, and Semyon ended the discussion with a single phrase, told her it was time to do her homework. After his stepdaughter had just told her mother what this person had been doing to her, he ended the conversation with an instruction about schoolwork, like an adult who knows better, and Alfia didn't object, didn't say quote 4, didn't ask him to leave. Didn't question whether the accused was really the person who should be present during such a conversation. The conversation ended. Irina left the room with an understanding worse than any refusal. Her mother didn't just not believe her. Her mother had given him the right to decide when the conversation was over. Fall break. Mother at work. Semyon alone with Irina again. He came into her room, but the pretext was that she hadn't cleaned up in time. And that's when he said a phrase that would echo through this case again and again. "You're playing with fire." An argument started. It moved from the bedroom to the living room, the one where the surveillance camera was. There, Semyon again began making advances on his stepdaughter. This time, Irina didn't resist. According to her testimony, she was too frightened. What happened next is documented in the case files. Semyon committed acts that the investigation would later classify under the most severe statute, involving the use of an object. The details remained in the interrogation transcript, and they leave no room for ambiguity. Afterward, he sent her to the shower and said one thing that perhaps explains his internal logic better than any expert assessment. He promised, quote 6, until January. Not quote 7, not quote 8. A pause. A schedule. As if this were about a timetable, not about what he had just done to a person entrusted to his care. This happened in the living room where the camera was. What it recorded and whether it captured that specific moment, at that point, no one knew except Semyon. The morning of November 18th. Semyon walks Irina to school. An ordinary route, an ordinary day. And along the way, he says those words again. Quote 9. The same phrase, the same voice. A few weeks earlier, when he had said it the last time, it was followed by the worst thing that had ever happened to her. And now he was saying it again. The promise until January had turned out to be hollow. Irina understood. It was all happening again. She reached school, sat at her desk, class began. And during class, she started crying. Not quietly, not hidden away. She simply couldn't hold it in anymore. The phrase said that morning worked like the final blow against a wall she had been building for months. The teacher noticed, came over, asked what had happened, and Irina told her. Not her mother, who hadn't heard her 3 times. Not the stepfather's mother, who had written it off as a joke. Not her friend, who had already tried and it hadn't helped. The teacher, a stranger, the only adult who happened to be nearby at that moment and asked the question. Irina told her that her mother's partner was assaulting her. The teachers responded the way all the adults before them should have responded. They contacted law enforcement. An investigation began. After the teachers made their report, everything moved quickly. A criminal case was opened. Irina was removed from the family and placed in a shelter, and Semyon was detained. The investigator seized the surveillance camera from the apartment. Alfia learned that her daughter had told the teachers. Strangers, those who believed her the first time, without clarifying questions, without checking for inconsistencies, without interrogations in the presence of the accused. For the mother, this was probably a blow, but not the kind that makes someone reconsider their position, the kind that reinforces it. Alfia remained on Semyon's side. She was certain her daughter had falsely accused an innocent man, and she intended to prove it. While the investigation was ongoing, a detail surfaced that at first glance worked against Irina. Before the case was opened, Semyon and Alfia had discovered their stepdaughter's messages with her friends. Irina had been discussing her stepfather with them, wishing the worst for him, brainstorming ways to drive a wedge between him and her mother. She wrote directly. She wanted him gone from their lives. But reaching her friends wasn't easy. Her phone was controlled, her time with it limited. So Irina found a workaround. She convinced the daughter of her mother's friend to invite them over. There, she used this acquaintance's account to log into the messenger and contact Olya, bypassing the control through someone else's profile, like a person who had been cut off from all legitimate channels to the outside world. And when Semyon and Alfia read these messages, everything became crystal clear to them. The teenager had been deliberately plotting to remove her stepfather. The assault accusation, according to their version, was part of this plan, a lie to achieve a goal, manipulation. Later, the messages were deleted. Most likely, Irina realized her communications had been exposed, but the contents were already known to both adults. For Alfia, these messages became the main evidence. Her daughter wasn't a victim, but a schemer. For Semyon, confirmation that the accusations were motivated by revenge, not actual events. But there's another way to look at the same events. A teenager, trapped in an apartment with a person who was assaulting her, stripped of her phone, cut off from friends, finding any loophole to connect with the outside world. Using other people's accounts, discussing how to get rid of the threat, wishing harm on her abuser. The same messages, 2 readings. Which one is accurate depends on what was actually happening in that apartment. Irina was removed from the family and placed in a shelter. A place every teenager fears. A place that sounds like punishment. But for Irina, it became a refuge. According to her own testimony, she liked it there. The phrasing was simple, almost childlike. Quote, 10, not quote 11, not quote 12, not quote 13. No one yells at me. That's what mattered most to her. And what used to happen when her mother left for work, none of that existed in the shelter. No control, no shouting, no footsteps in the hallway, followed by her bedroom door opening. Perhaps for the first time in a long while, she fell asleep without anxiety, without listening, without expecting. But a shelter isn't a home. And there's no mom in the shelter. The same mom Irina had waited 8 years for. The one who hadn't believed her even once. who had invited Semyon to be present during the conversation and didn't object when he ended it with a line about homework. The peace in the shelter was real, but so was the longing for her mother. And over time, the longing began to outweigh. Irina started asking to go home, but Child Protective Services wouldn't let her. And at home, Alfia waited, alone, without her daughter, without Semyon, in an empty apartment, with an idle camera, and a firm conviction that it was all Irina's fault. The initial relief from the shelter faded. The quiet, the safety, all of it was still there. But quiet isn't Mom. And Mom was the only thing Irina had wanted her whole life. And perhaps that very logic kicked in inside the mind of a 14-year-old. Not legal logic, not strategic, but a child's logic. Simple. If I say I lied, they'll give me back my mom. And Irina wrote to the investigator, to the prosecutor, that she had made everything up, that she had falsely accused her stepfather. According to Alfia, her daughter had already admitted she had invented it all. For the mother, this was confirmation of what she had been saying from the start. Her daughter had lied, Semyon was innocent, the system had made a mistake. But then something happened that Alfia hadn't expected. The investigation didn't accept Irina's new testimony into the case. Child Services didn't release her to go home. The investigation continued. Quote 14, she would later tell journalists. To the mother, this looked absurd. To the investigators, probably, like a classic picture of environmental pressure. Homesickness, a victim's attempt to rewind, to get back what was lost. Investigators had seen this before. Irina wanted to go home, and she paid for it with the only currency she had, retracting her own words. But the door didn't open. Instead, Child Protective Services went to court and secured the termination of Alfia's parental rights. Irina was transferred from the shelter to a children's home. Not temporary placement, but permanent. Not, quote, 1-5, but legal. Alfia was no longer her mother by law. For 8 years, Irina had waited for her mom to get out of the colony. She did. She lived with her for a few months, from April to November of 2024, 6 months, and then she lost her again. The first time, because her mother got caught with the drop packages. The second time, because her mother chose a man. Child Services assessed the situation and concluded returning the teenager to this family was not an option. The mother hadn't protected her daughter, hadn't believed her, had sided with the accused, had allowed a situation where the minor was left alone with the person she herself had complained about. During the investigation, a psychological evaluation identified signs of mixed conduct and emotional disorder in Irina. For Alfia, the termination of parental rights was devastating. She didn't understand. Her daughter herself had said she had lied, that she wanted to go home. Why wouldn't they let her? The system that was supposed to protect families had, in her logic, destroyed hers. That's how it looked from the apartment where now just one woman lived. Without her daughter, without her man, without rights over her own teenager. And Irina ended up in a children's home, a place where you don't ask to go home anymore because there is no home left. The case went to trial, closed proceedings, as required in cases involving minors. Semyon maintained complete innocence. Alfia testified on his behalf and characterized him before the court as a very kind person. And then a detail surfaced that hadn't come up before the trial. During the investigation, it was discovered that Semyon's ex-wife Yekaterina had previously filed a report against him, the same one he had left. After the divorce, she had contacted law enforcement about the distribution of intimate material, and the suspect was Semyon. This wasn't part of the charges in Irina's case, but it was part of the overall picture. The one the court saw in full, and Alfia refused to see. And then Irina entered the courtroom. At trial, she repeated her original testimony, all of it in full. The retraction was set aside. Looking into the face of the system that had removed her from home, terminated her mother's parental rights, and placed her in a children's home, she chose to tell the truth. Knowing that truth wouldn't bring her mother back, knowing that her mother was sitting in that same courtroom, calling the man Irina was accusing, quote, 17. The prosecution's case rested on Irina's testimony, her friend's testimony, the ex-wife's report, and the case materials. There wasn't much direct evidence, but the court found the evidence sufficient. And Alfia, after the trial, would tell journalists, "When I get my daughter back, we'll work on getting Semyon out. He's not angry at Irina, he's staying calm because he understands she was just upset. The problem is that adults believed her words so quickly." Semyon received nearly the maximum sentence. He continued to maintain his innocence. Alfia continued to believe him. That could have been the end. But one question remained. What happened? That's already clear. But why? Why didn't the mother believe her daughter? Not the first time, not the second, not the third, not even when the teachers contacted the authorities, not even when the court issued its verdict. And the answer probably isn't stupidity or indifference. It lies in those 8 years of incarceration. Semyon became part of her dream of a normal life before she was even released. He met her, became the man in her home. He was proof that Alfia wasn't a lost cause, but a normal woman with a family. Believing Irina would have meant destroying all of that. Admitting that the very first mistake after release had led to a catastrophe. Accepting that was probably psychologically impossible. Now it all looks different. The letters from prison, the interrogation with Semyon present, the camera in the apartment. They weren't monitoring the man. They were monitoring the teenager, because the teenager was the problem, and the man was the pillar of support. Irina lost her mom twice. At 6, when she was incarcerated. At 14, when her mother refused to believe her. She chose the truth and was left alone. Dear viewers, if you observe something similar happening to your acquaintances, to your children, to your daughters, to your underage sons, please investigate, listen, and feel the truth. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment. See you next time.